Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and production of this episode was made possible by a grant from the Roller-Bottimore Foundation of Richmond, Virginia. Hello, and welcome to episode 274 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think of English colonization in North America, many of us will think of Jamestown and how the English in 1607 established their first permanent colony along the James River within the Chesapeake Bay. But what do we know about how and why England came to establish its first permanent colony at Jamestown? And what do we know about the English colony that came before Jamestown, the Colony of Roanoke? Today, we're going to explore the how and why of England's early colonization plans by looking at the life of the architect of those plans, Sir Walter Ralegh. Alan Gallay, the Lyndon B. Chair of United States History at Texas Christian University, has written the most recent biography of Raleigh's life. It's called Walter Ralegh, Architect of Empire. And Alan joins us today to introduce us to Walter Raleigh's life and his work to create the blueprints for England's colonization of the Americas. Now, as we explore the life and work of Sir Walter Ralegh, Alan reveals who Walter Ralegh was and details about his life as an alchemist, soldier, and colonizer. Information about how Raleigh became acquainted with Queen Elizabeth I, and Raleigh's efforts to colonize Virginia, which in the late 16th century meant all of North America's eastern seaboard north of Florida. But first, what does the United States mean by equality? What does and has it intended by its statement, all men are created equal? The United States has long held the idea of equality as one of its founding principles, and its ideas about equality in terms of social, economic, and political opportunities have changed a lot over time. On Wednesday, June 10 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, the Omohundro Institute will be hosting a live conversation with historians Daniel Mandel and Heather Cox Richardson about equality. These two scholars have just released new books on the subject of equality. Daniel Mandel's The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, 1600 to 1870, and Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War. And the conversation we'll have with these two authors will take us through Americans' changing ideas on the principle of equality from the 1600s to the present. So, I hope you will join the OI for what I think will be a fascinating conversation on equality. This June 10th conversation is free to attend. All you need to do is register, and you can do that by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/register. That's benfranklinsworld.com/register. All right, are you ready to venture back into the 16th century to explore the life and colonization plans of Sir Walter Ralegh? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is the Lyndon B. Chair of United States History at Texas Christian University. He's the author of numerous books, including The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South, 1670 to 1717, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize, and, most recently, Walter Ralegh, Architect of Empire. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Alan Gallay.
Thank you, Liz. Happy to be here.
So, Alan, over the course of your career, you've written many books about Native Americans, the Indian slave trade, the rise of the planter elite in the early American Southeast. And now you've written this biography about Sir Walter Ralegh. And I'm curious, how does Ralegh fit within your work on Native American history? How did you come to write a biography about him?
Sure. Ralegh was actually one of the most accomplished, talented, and famed individuals of his time in England. Really quite accomplished in so many areas. And he earned fame, sort of lasting fame, as the founder of the first English colony in North America. But in his own time and afterwards, he earned fame as a historian, as an alchemist, producing medicines. In fact, the medicines he produced were still being used into the 20th century. For an ethnology he wrote, as a poet, as an explorer, a pirate, He did so many things, and most famously as a courtier who courted Queen Elizabeth. So he's a fascinating individual. And for me, his story is about Native America because he does found the first colony, and also because he spent so much time thinking and theorizing about how the English should interact with native peoples. And he wrote about these things. He wrote papers for the Queen. He wrote a book. He befriended many native peoples, both in Europe and then in the Americas. So there really is a thread with my other work. And in fact, I look at this as the prequel to the Indian slave trade, that in all my work, I've tried to understand in colonialism the interactions of native peoples with the English and how the English understood the native peoples. And I sort of worked backwards from the 18th century, where native peoples, played particular kind of roles in North America in regards to colonialism, and then back into the 17th century, looking at how the enslavement of native peoples was at the root of the English experience here in America, that the enslavement took place in virtually all the colonies and provided capital for the early colonists. And then to go back to England a century earlier, to the late 16th century, and to see what did the English think about indigenous peoples before they even met them. And then when they first meet them, how do they react? How do they adjust their thoughts? And then what do they come up with moving forward? And in all of this, Raleigh plays a key role. So there is this thread. And for me, it goes back 30 years, actually even longer, to coming across Sir Walter Ralegh in graduate school and thinking, boy, this character's fascinating. And people talk about him, though, in so many different ways. It's hard to make sense of him. And I thought, one day I'm going to get to this guy, because I wasn't ready yet. And after I finished the Indian slave trade, I thought, okay, now it's time. Now it's time to move back to the Renaissance, to the 16th century, and look at this very foundation for American society. Where did it come from in its European roots?
So your journey with Walter Raleigh is really an old historian's tale, right? Where a scholar encounters a character in the early days of their research, in the early days of their career, and then just keeps encountering that character even as they move on to other research topics.
Oh, yes. And I went to England twice to teach American students there. And within a couple of days of being there, I went to the Tower of London, and you can still see his apartments where he was imprisoned 3 times. And I remember thinking that this was many years ago. It's like, boy, I really got to catch up with what this guy's all about. And then I find that in that prison there, he had a laboratory. And I'm thinking, this is an interesting, complex puzzle that's worth unraveling. And indeed, the payoff has been far greater than I could have imagined.
Well, I know we would like to better understand and unravel the life of Sir Walter Raleigh, which leaves us with a question of, where do we begin to do that? Where do you think the life of Walter Raleigh really begins?
Literally, we begin where his family's from, in Devonshire, which is in southwest England. And he is very much a part of a network of families. They all call themselves cousins, whether they were or not. And they work together in a lot of different ways. And in particular, these are people who see the sea as their future and as England's future, and many of them were involved in seagoing activities. So they share in common piracy, naval service, defense of fortresses along the coast. They have a certain kind of life in common. And secondly, a lot of them are very well educated. And it's not clear to me always where they're getting their education from. It seems to be tutors. Raleigh did go off to Oxford, as did some of his brothers, but it seems like from an early age that they're very well educated. It's a lifelong process with them. Just to give you an idea, Raleigh and all of his brothers worked in laboratories. They were all alchemists, which today we would think of as chemists. So the fact that he and his brothers are all doing the same kinds of activities, and that there are other people in the area doing these activities, shows it's sort of the idea of how a village raises a child. And in his case, his family has direct connection with the future Queen Elizabeth, because his great aunt was her governess. And so these people who live on the periphery, they live all the way out in the southwest of England. They're really not connected to London society. They have, through this one individual, a direct connection to the future monarch. And that will open the door when Elizabeth becomes queen to other members of the family and other peoples from this area of southwest England to have influence by gaining the queen's attention and doing her service, particularly at sea. These are her salty dogs who she admired, who could make her money and could carry out policy for her in diplomacy and in warfare. So they fill a certain niche for her. And she appreciates them. People like Sir Francis Drake, who circumnavigates the globe, and George Grenville, and of course Raleigh and his older brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, his half-brother, who's about 18 years older than Walter, and sort of provides a pathway for him into court after he gets the queen's attention. So what I found was that family and neighborhood influence, and I use the word neighborhood because Elizabeth did. Elizabeth understood that people from a particular neighborhood area have ties to one another, and it's important to keep these people together. So when colonization came up in Ireland, she urged that places be settled by neighborhood, that they carry these same ties between them from England to wherever they're going.
It's interesting that you say that Walter Raleigh was interested in alchemy, that he was kind of an early chemist, because we do associate Raleigh with colonization. So could you talk a little bit more about Raleigh's interest in alchemy and what role alchemy may have played in Raleigh's interest in colonization?
I think it's actually central to who he and many of his fellows were, and that it's one of the things that ties them together because it's part of their worldview, and colonialism and alchemy go hand in hand. And part of it is that at this moment in time, in the Renaissance, the intellectuals had a view of the world where God created everything. So every material thing had a purpose. And so what humans should be doing is finding the purpose. You can't understand God, but they thought you could, by studying the material world, understand creation, so understand God's purpose. So they were materialist in that sense. So in the laboratory, they wanted to discover the nature of things and turn one thing into another. Usually we think of in the laboratory, the alchemist trying to turn lead into gold or brass into silver. In fact, Humphrey Gilbert invested heavily into turning one kind of metal into another. So they're very involved in those processes, but they're really thinking about things like medicine as well. And it's every little thing. Everything has a purpose. So when they were exposed to America, they thought there's going to be all these different kinds of material things out there. And to go abroad to the Americas, you could find these things and assay them, figure out their qualities, and then use them, particularly for medicine, for health purposes, but also for all kinds of things, including for wealth. So for Raleigh being an alchemist, he's a student of the universe. And for many of these people, and it's not just in England, it's throughout Europe, they thought there must be a reason that at this moment in time that God has revealed the Americas to us being in Europe. And their first signs was that America was this place of incredible abundance. All they had to do was look at Spain and look at all the gold and silver they had accumulated. So they thought, if we go to America, we could partake in and understand these blessings that God has bestowed, not just on the indigenous peoples there, but now actually on the entire world. Because why else did he keep these continents secret from us and then show them at this point in time? There must be a reason for it. So it was almost like a spiritual quest. It is a material quest, but for them, the material and the spiritual are connected. And, they were often running, looking to find the mysteries of the universe in the Americas.
That's really interesting because we often think of these explorers going out across the Atlantic, trying to find different trade routes so that they can enhance the economic situations of their kingdoms. And yet it also sounds like these quests to find these new trade routes and to explore the Americas was largely about religion and science.
Yes, and they definitely were about trade too. I wouldn't shortchange that. In fact, the precedent for a lot of this is They're going abroad and they're finding these wonderful things. But what they're finding that's wonderful is coming from Asia. And so when they go to the Americas, they're thinking that's a new way to get to Asia. There's always material circumstances driving overseas expansion because it's so expensive. But what these materialists do is they carry with them in their pocket interest in, while we're out there, what can we find out about the minerals and the crystals and these things related to their, spiritual views of the world. Some people thought, like John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's mathematician, that this was going to bring on the millennium. And some of them thought by going to the Arctic and looking for these trade routes, actually this was part of the process of finding out mysteries of the universe that were going to lead to the second coming of Christ. So it's not that they're separate threads, it's actually that they're interwoven.
Now, earlier you mentioned that one of the things that gave Raleigh a leg up in his career as an alchemist, explorer, and colonizer was that he had a family connection to Queen Elizabeth I. Could you tell us more about how Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth became acquainted?
Yes. First of all, there was Humphrey laying the groundwork. Humphrey Gilbert, his older half-brother, had gotten her attention because of his dashing good looks and his intellect. And those were two of the things she very much appreciated in men. She liked them younger than her, much younger than her. She liked them to be virile. She liked to go hunting. She liked to dance. She loved them behaving as knights. King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, this was sort of their milieu, from hundreds of years old. They play acted. They wrote poetry like the knights did, adopted the personas of people from King Arthur's tales. And so Humphrey and then Walter both fit the model here that she appreciated. And first, Humphrey won her approval because he served her in Ireland in the First Desmond War. He was a very violent man, and his brand of violence was quite successful in basically ending the war, and she appreciated that. And so she gave him other tasks to do. And along the way, because he could appear at court as a courtier, he wrote state papers for her. He was an alchemist and building an academy that would train a generation of young Englishmen to serve the monarch and build an empire. And he also particularly wanted to colonize in America, whereas a lot of the other of those interested in overseas wanted to go exploring and look for the passages to Asia. His interest was colonizing, that we need to settle this land. And eventually he's going to get permission to do so. Well, meanwhile, his younger brother will serve in Ireland, and Walter gains fame as a captain. He gains fame for his bravery. So people are talking about how brave this young man is, how efficient and effective. And Walter, as a young man, became expert on Ireland. He was there for several years. And the Lord Deputy, who's the English governor of Ireland, would send him back to England to carry information of a diplomatic sort and to tell the Queen and her ministers what he needed. And while he was there, he gained the Queen's attention. So she got to see firsthand this dashing young man who had so many fine parts. And what he was able to do was really to worship the Queen. There was a cult developing, and he played a great role in this, in developing the cult of Elizabeth, where you teach the other members of court how to worship the Queen. And that included through poetry, through performances, especially through wit. He outdid other men in the use of his tongue, which created a lot of envy and also anger. He was a wordsmith. He mastered the English language, and he had a voice that his enemies said bewitched the Queen. And he, sort of leads this cult where he defines Elizabeth as multiple goddesses. And the rest of the court follows his cue. And everybody starts writing poetry for Elizabeth. And what he also showed was she's not going to take just any old poem. This has to be really thought out and articulate, have certain kinds of references. And she would write poetry and answer sometimes to their poems. So he became the courtier par excellence. And he started doing things at court, like he put jewels on his shoes. He introduced to the court the men wearing ruffs of lace around their collar. It makes the head look like a head on a plate. Only women had worn that. But now he introduces that to the court. The Earl of Oxford introduced men wearing gloves at court. But Raleigh had this great fashion sense. So a certain kind of sensuousness that the Queen appreciated. He also introduced, as far as we know, for the courtier to play songs that he would write for the Queen. So he's sort of the model for others. Through his wit and his charm and his efficiency, he steadily impressed the Queen and a lot of the people who worked in the government at his competence. And he joins his brother on one of his voyages to America, which was an absolute failure. But Raleigh got the farthest. He at least made it to Africa. He joined his brother on a second expedition, which also turned out to be a great failure. But he, maintained this reputation for just being this brave and bright individual who was a charmer. He just had a way with words. And even though a lot of people envied him, a lot of people adored him, especially other intellectuals. And that created this meteoric rise for him. And so after his brother died, she turned around and awarded him the monopoly rights to colonize America. It was fantastic, for him that this one individual had sole rights, and she made him captain of the guard. And as captain of the guard, that means he's responsible for her personal defense, and he has access to her at any moment. So by getting this access, he gets, all kinds of rewards. He has a monopoly over the sale of licenses to serve wine in England. He's given charge of the tin mines. Tin's very important, especially for armaments. And so he runs these tin mines, which actually have remained open till this century. He's made Lord Lieutenant of Cornwall. So he's responsible for raising men for service in Ireland and raising supplies. He's given so many tasks to do, and he becomes so efficient at these that for many of those in the government, they say, oh, yeah, this guy's on the ball. He really knows what he's doing, and he keeps the Queen happy. And he shows us how to keep the Queen happy as well.
So Raleigh sounds like he was quite the charmer and really benefited from his talent in charming the Queen. Now, when Raleigh received the monopoly right to colonize the Americas, what did he make of that right? Could you tell us a bit about Raleigh's interests in colonizing the Americas and what kinds of plans he had for establishing English colonies?
When I first studied this, and I'd read in the secondary sources, the historians would make it sound the English just blundered into colonizing, that they didn't know what they were doing and they don't really plan because they couldn't perceive how people could have planned for something so dramatically different than what they were used to. But Walter Raleigh was a deep planner. He's a deep thinker. He imagines what he needs to do, and then he plans in great detail. And the reasons for his success is he surrounded himself with other talented people who could help him do the planning. So one of his proteges was England's foremost scientist, Thomas Harriot, who was fresh out of Oxford. And Raleigh takes him into his household to teach him mathematics and other things. They become lifelong great friends. And Harriot serves him as this, phenomenal physicist and helps, as they're planning to go to America. What Raleigh has to figure out is, first of all, what are we going to do there? How are we going to make money? So we need to know the lay of the land and who are these indigenous peoples? What kinds of colonists should I send? What kinds of skills do they need? How are we even going to get there? They really didn't know how to sail there. They had a general idea, but they had to figure out everything. And Harriot helped. One is he designed the most technologically advanced ship in England for Raleigh, which would be used for 60, 70 years by the English government. He also was a master at theorizing about navigation. And Harriot is reputed to have created the flowchart. He created a system of ways of examining the sun and stars so that the ship captains could figure out how to navigate to America. And he created a flowchart where they didn't have to know the theories. They could just do the measurement and they could go, okay, if this happens, go to this next step. If something else happens, you go a different way. So he taught Raleigh's sailors how to get to America, basically. So Raleigh gathered the supplies, and Raleigh himself did things like, I remember when I was in the British Library, I discovered Raleigh's handwritten recipe for how to barrel beef, to take on the ships, to keep it preserved. I mean, he had that kind of mind for detail. So what he did was he set off an expedition just to go for 2 months to America. And he had an idea of where to send them. And I'm not sure exactly how he got the idea, but generally historians think he wanted to get close enough to Florida because of the temperate nature of it, but not too close where the Spanish who were in Florida could come wipe them out. And so approximately where North Carolina and Virginia are today is where the English wanted to head. And this first expedition went. They established fairly good relations with native peoples. They espied the land a bit. And the most important thing they did was Raleigh had told them to bring back some native peoples. And he apparently did this with their permission, 2 native peoples by the name of Wanchese and Manteo. And that was actually the great success of this first expedition, because the ships came back with natives, and it proved that Raleigh's ships had been to America. People were so skeptical and cynical about the Americas with almost every expedition. And even when Raleigh went searching for El Dorado, there were people who said, no, he never went to America. It was like going to the moon, as far as a lot of people were concerned. No, he couldn't have been there. The English did not go there. So there were a lot of naysayers. So he brought back people who actually were natives, paraded them around London for people to see. And, that gave the proof. But what was even more important was that these native peoples gave Raleigh a lot of knowledge about what was going on. Thomas Harriot, his physicist, charge and buddy, was a master linguist and quickly learned their language and taught them English. So he sent them and Harriet on the second expedition to Roanoke. And what's amazing about this, you're sending England's foremost scientists. It's like sending Stephen Hawking to the moon, would be sending Harriet to the Americas to tell us as a physicist what is out there in this strange new world. And so he goes and he spends about 10 months there, and he's with a painter that Raleigh sent, John White. And all 3 of these men, White, Harriet, and Raleigh, are going to have close connections in colonization in Ireland as well. But they're first working here in North America. And so White paints the native peoples, and Harriet writes about the native peoples. And they travel up and down, but especially to the north of the Atlantic coast. Most of the settlers stay on Roanoke Island. But because they have Manteo with them, they have someone who can take them along the landscape. Wanchese, by the way, hated the English. So the 2 natives who came over, they had 2 very different views of England. As soon as Wanchese got back to America, he ran off with his people and became an inveterate enemy. Whereas Manteo becomes this great ally and friend in the coming years. So anyway, they collect all this information, bring it back to Raleigh, and he overlooks Harriet writing the first book by an Englishman who'd been to what's now the United States about America to publicize what the English had done and what they hoped to do. And meanwhile, White had all these paintings he brought back. So now Raleigh had more information where he could see what's there. And Raleigh arranges for these paintings to be engraved alongside of captions that Harriet creates about the paintings and alongside the book that Harriet wrote about Virginia. He named Virginia, by the way, for the Queen. And Virginia meant really just that Atlantic coast area, the mid-Atlantic. But anyway, they got this publisher, Theodore de Bry, who's Flemish, from what's today Belgium, who took the paintings and took the writings and moved to Frankfurt, where he'd opened up a publishing company, essentially. And he published this work in 4 languages, Latin, German, French, and English. And this was a phenomenal publication that was then sold throughout Europe. It actually begins the first of 25 volumes on America and almost equally long series on Asia, published by this same publisher, Theodore de Bry and his family, who are, by the way, leading alchemists. So they have that tie with Raleigh. This becomes, by the way, the foundation for the later Library of Congress, because these volumes were so powerful. And the most important volume was this volume on Virginia, because it publicized to Europe what the English had accomplished on their very first try in this colony. The colony hasn't disappeared yet. It hasn't been destroyed. And what it showed was that Raleigh and the English sort of knew what they were doing and how advanced they were. And the advancement was because there was a depiction of the natives that showed sympathy. There's no depictions of English in these pictures. They're all of native peoples or of animals and insects, but it's basically of the peoples. And it showed, wow, the Spanish have been in America for 75 years, and the Spanish, because of the Black Legend and because of their activities, have this reputation for violence, for conquest, for enslavement of the Indians. And then you see this almost like out of nowhere, this English volume that's going all over Europe. Wow, the English are showing the native people differently. There's this intimacy showing how natives vary by age, how they treat their children, how they eat, how they sit. It's like a step-by-step process of just showing daily life among native peoples. And it's this really remarkable volume on Virginia. In fact, there's not another ethnology like this of what becomes the United States Indians in the United States until the invention of the camera hundreds of years later. So this is a very special moment in time, and Raleigh's riding the waves of this. He's got this going, and at the same time, the Queen says, you need to colonize Ireland. That's imperative right now. So he's juggling what's going on with his American colonies, trying to develop that, with he needs to colonize Ireland. And simultaneously, he gets interest in going to South America. So all three areas he's going to try to colonize, 3 different continents at the same time. It's just a remarkable burst of energy and planning. And in fact, with the South American example, he starts that in the early 1580s, the planning, he sets it in motion, but he doesn't actually go till 1594 and 1595 because he gets caught up in other events. But the planning took place for 10 years.
Wow. Raleigh really did have a lot going on, didn't he? And from what you've described, it really sounds like this book by Thomas Harriot and John White was a treasure trove of information about Indigenous people. Do you think that's an accurate assessment of their book? That it's a treasure trove of information about Indigenous people and Indigenous history?
Yes, I think it is. Historians know all about the book, but I wish what people also paid more attention to were actually his captions for the paintings. Almost nobody discusses the captions. And that is a good compliment to the book, because the captions are often a half page long, sometimes even longer, as descriptions of native life. But in general, the book itself, it goes into native cosmology, it goes into the landscape, it provides for John Smith later at Jamestown really a list of what should you look for in America. So it becomes a blueprint for him. And in fact, I think it's a model for the many books he wrote on America. He's got this model of this great mind Harriet saying, we need to think about the trees. We need to think about the native peoples. We need to think about how do native peoples understand the universe? What's their cosmology? There's just so much sensitivity in Harriet writing and in White's paintings, especially in the paintings and the captions that go with them. There's a non-judgmental nature that they provide. They're recording. This is the rise of experiential science, Baconianism, where you gather evidence. What do you learn from experience? What's the evidence? And even if you don't know the answers, just tell us what you found. And that's what they do. There's a native dance that White records in a painting, and he shows the steps. It's just ingenious how he shows the steps of the dance undertaken by over a dozen characters. So we know it's a dance, but even if we can't make sense of the dance, he's saying to Raleigh and to whoever's going to look at this, we can at least study these things, and they're worthy of study. So Harriet's the same way with his writing. He's much taken with native culture, and they're not sympathetic in a fawning kind of way. It's more of a matter-of-fact kind of way, that these are interesting people. They are worthy of study. And then there are coded messages in the paintings themselves, which are fascinating. And this was one of my great finds, were these coded messages. I had some help with some colleagues, for instance, when I taught at Ohio State, who were familiar with some of the Hermeticism of this time, this religious philosophy that Raleigh and others had, where they send out messages to Europe through the paintings that these natives are specially blessed by God. We don't have to fear them. And not only that, we can learn from them. And that's fascinating too. The volume on Virginia that Raleigh has produced, White didn't make a painting to open the volume, but the engraver, who's also a Hermeticist and alchemist like Raleigh, had created an engraving to start the volume on Adam and Eve. And in the second volume on Florida, we'll create one of Noah and the Ark. And like the Noah engraving is almost never repeated when people republish the book. They leave it out because, well, that's not natives. Why are we going to have a picture about, Noah coming off the ark? And the same with Adam and Eve. People are just not interested because that's not about Virginia. And yet these are the two most important paintings in the volumes, because both of them are designed to show how native peoples fit into the family of humanity and that they have been blessed by God. In the first case, that they live in Eden, and that God has given them the means to live and flourish there, the ingenuity, so that all these paintings, and also Harriet will write about how they create their piroguas, their canoes, how they fish, their cooking, their smoking of meat. There's all kinds of knowledge that the natives have. And the point is, they got these from God. And you can see this in the painting with these symbols that are put in there. So everybody knows, oh, now we know where they got these things. This isn't the work of the devil, it's the work of God. So, what Raleigh's doing in Virginia is meant to tie his colony really to larger issues that certainly intellectuals, Catholics and Protestants, both, had the same kind of view of, that there's something special in America that can help solve Europe's problems. And I think in particular what it was the disarray, the violence that came out of the Reformation, that you have a Catholic versus Protestant divide in Europe that has been leading to massacres that take place in a variety of places. So these massacres weigh heavily on people's minds, as well as the intolerance. And people are like Raleigh are looking to America for answers. They're universalists. And he'll even write about this. He thinks it's ridiculous that Christians, are at each other's throats. So people like Raleigh think, well, if these Indians have been blessed by God, we need to learn from them. And maybe they can help us solve our problems in a lot of different ways. And ultimately, he comes to write that the Christians should not even try to convert the heathen people, that their religions can be holy as well. I mean, it's phenomenal argument for tolerance that he writes about in his last book, The History of the World. And it comes out of his views of native peoples and his view of the universe and the material culture and so on. Specifically, for instance, he argues that there is only oneness in the universe, and that's God. Everything else is diverse. Humans, minerals, everything is diverse. And he actually starts talking about diversity of all things in his History of the World, and how just basic it is to the human condition, and how, we need to be tolerant of people's religious beliefs. He's not tolerant of evil. It's not that he's a pacifist. He comes out of the utopian tradition of Sir Thomas More in the early 16th century, where you're trying to create a better society or a better world even. But that doesn't mean you tolerate evil. So there are bad guys. And to Raleigh and many of the English, the bad guys are the Spanish, although not inherently because they're Spanish, but because Spain itself is trying to conquer England. And so bad guys need to be stopped. But that doesn't mean you should persecute people because of their religious beliefs. So he's very contemplative and in many ways transcendent, in a lot of these ideas, because in the midst of religious wars, he's talking about tolerance. And you know what? He says, leave the Indians alone to their religion. Let's not try to change them even. If and when they want missionaries, he tells the queen, wait till they ask for them. Otherwise, in fact, he says, if we send missionaries to them, you can expect them to be killed. And they have a right, because the idea of this time was no one should have a right to come into your land and try and convert you to their religion. So he says, if we're sending missionaries, you better send them armed.
Now, before we talk about the colonization of Ireland, I wonder if you would tell us about the colony of Roanoke, which you mentioned a little earlier. Because we often hear that Jamestown was the first English colony in North America, but there was this earlier English colony called Roanoke. So could you tell us about Roanoke?
Yes. So Roanoke was the first place that Raleigh went, and it's the first English colony. And after that second expedition with Harriet, he sends a third one, and that one's to begin permanent colonization. Now, the second expedition had fallen apart, in large part because of violence. The English had attacked local native peoples, led by their commander. And what Raleigh and his people realized was they couldn't go back to Roanoke, that they had already alienated the peoples there. And Harriet had already explored northward and said, that land's not even that good down there. Where we need to go is to Chesapeake Bay up in modern-day Virginia. So the third expedition was just supposed to stop at Roanoke, as far as we know, and pick up some people who had gone there, not realizing the second expedition had departed, and they had remained there. There were about 18, allegedly, that were supposed to still be there. Well, when they didn't find them there, the navigator who carried them there said, you know what, I'm not taking you up to Virginia. I want to go pirating. He dropped the colonists there and just left them. And John White, who was now governor of the colony, which is remarkable in itself, that Raleigh made a painter governor of the Roanoke colony because he wanted to make sure the violence would not be returned. Instead of having a soldier, we'll have this painter who is sympathetic with the Indians and knows how to get along with them. I mean, that's just remarkable in the history of colonialism that you assign a painter to be your governor. But the people asked him to go home and tell Raleigh of their circumstances, that they're stuck at Roanoke. So they were supposed to go up to where Jamestown later will be settled. And this is going to become the famed lost colony because the colony is not relieved for years. Spain does invade England, sends the Spanish Armada in 1588 to conquer England. And by the time Raleigh is able to send ships, he tries actually a couple of times and things keep falling through. And finally, John White returns and the colony's gone. It becomes the famed lost colony. So that's already at the end of the 1580s. Well, Jamestown's not going to be settled till 1607. So that's almost 20 years later, really. So when the English finally do come back under King James I, they've got no intention of going back to the Roanoke area. And that's why they do go further north into the Chesapeake, which was much better placed for building a colony. So that's the first permanent colony because Roanoke had disappeared.
Do we know what happened to the lost settlers of the Roanoke colony?
Not for sure, but most historians believe that what they do is they go off and live with some of the native people. There's evidence that they live with the Croatans, a particular group, and that for reasons we're not sure, in the year before John Smith arrived in 1606, that the English settlers were all killed. So, the English did try to gather evidence of what had happened, during the John Smith colony, and that's probably what happened.
Okay, earlier you mentioned that Queen Elizabeth told Raleigh, while he's trying to establish colonies in Virginia and at Roanoke, that he also had to help colonize Ireland. And many historians have said that if you really want to understand how the English colonized North America, then you need to take a look at what England did in Ireland. So, Alan, would you tell us more about England's colonization of Ireland and Raleigh's involvement with it?
Yes. So colonization of Ireland was different than America in that in America, Raleigh could basically do whatever he wanted. There were just a few ground rules that Queen Elizabeth gave him. The colony's his. He can, really set up any kind of legal system he wants, distribute land however he wants. But in Ireland, that's under her. It's a royal colony. That's what we would call it. It's directly under the monarch. So in Ireland, they did an incredible amount of planning for the Munster Plantation. This was in the south of Ireland, and it's the place where the first two Desmond Wars had largely been fought. A lot of the people had fled the lands, had died due to really forced starvation in many ways because the English had destroyed crops to starve people into submission. And the idea Elizabeth had was to send English colonists to take their place, to take the place of traitors. Those who were convicted of treason, their land is called attainted, and that land goes to the monarch. So it's her land, and she can give it away. And so she wanted colonists there. Why does she want this? Because the fear England had was that Spain was going to move into Ireland and use it as a launching pad to conquer England. So even though the First Armada failed in 88, that fear remains true till the end of the century for another 12, 15 years, that Spain will come back and conquer England. So the idea was to send English settlers, colonists, and most of them would get their land from, you're going to love this word, the undertakers. The undertakers were people who Elizabeth granted large estates to, and then they would distribute the land to others. Well, what are they going to do about this land? How are they going to use it? Where are they going to get colonists? And so Raleigh is given the largest chunk to colonize. And he's supposed to create the model for what to do there. What he does is, so not only does he distribute land, and he's a successful recruiter of colonists, but he sets up an array of economic activities. Lumber, there's going to be glass making, iron works, a big salmon industry, barrel making. The barrel making is really important. He directs the lumber yards he has created to make what we call pipe staves. These are huge barrels, can be 5.5, 6 feet tall to carry wine. And he connects his part of Ireland to the Atlantic world. He has the barrels made. He has ships sent with the barrels off to the Madeira Islands, to the Canary Islands to pick up wine. They pay for the wine by leaving some barrels there because they need barrels on those islands. And then he ships the wine to England and other places, but especially to England, because he's also got the licenses, remember, for the taverns. Well, they need to sell wine, so he can make more money that way as well. So he's developing, his economic interest in Ireland and settling the land. And it's a very complex situation. He doesn't, I don't want to say he makes a great success of it, but in some ways he does. It provides security for the English in that area. A lot of those colonists become like soldiers or militia for the area. But he does provide a model, especially for the person who eventually takes over his lands, Richard Boyle, who becomes the richest man in Ireland by just taking what Raleigh did and expanding on it, and rises to become the Earl of Cork. So Raleigh, his planning did work in Ireland with his development of the lands, but for other circumstances, he doesn't really make a lot of money off of the enterprise, and he gets sidetracked by his work in England for the Queen. So he's never really able to develop it like his successor was.
Now, at the start of our conversation, you mentioned that Raleigh was a 3-time inmate at the Tower of London, and that he even had a laboratory there so he could do his alchemy work. Could you tell us how Raleigh ended up in the Tower of London 3 times and what his imprisonment was really like?
Yes, it's not imprisonment like we think it, because in England and in other countries in Europe, your treatment in prison is based upon your position in society. So if you're an earl, for instance, you get a certain number of servants in prison to look after your interests, to feed you and take care of you. And Raleigh's not as high as an earl, but he's allowed apartments because he was, basically like a first minister to the Queen. And he goes there the first time because Queen Elizabeth threw him in prison. He had married one of her ladies in waiting, and he did so without permission, so they were both thrown into prison. Elizabeth could be vengeful, and he gets out of prison for various reasons. Although he is exiled from court, he's not allowed to return for years. The second time he's imprisoned is the longest period, and that's under King James when Elizabeth dies and James takes over. He doesn't like Raleigh for a variety of reasons, and Raleigh is accused of treason, and he's convicted, and he's put into prison basically from 1603 to 1616. He's there like 13 years. But right from the start, he's allowed a laboratory because he had made a cordial, a medicine, for King James's wife, Queen Anne. And where all of her physicians could not cure her, and I don't know what the illness was, it's never said, Raleigh's cordial did. So she becomes his patron that guarantees that he has 24-hour access to his laboratory, which was built in a garden inside the Tower of London. And people from all over Europe of the elite who come to court then try to get Raleigh to create medicines for them. And these are the medicines, these cordials, that were still being made in the United States until the 20th century, the early 20th century. So these were, powerful medicines. In fact, many of the monarchs of England through the centuries took these, what were called Raleigh's cordials. So he did have a privileged position in prison, but he wasn't allowed out. His wife was allowed to visit him for a while. She could spend the night, and then she was barred from doing that. And he had two natives who lived outside of the prison who could visit him and keep him company every day and help him with his experiments. And eventually both those natives went back to South America. And when Raleigh went to South America, he visited with one of them. So, he kept those ties. Raleigh does get out of prison the second time and winds up going to South America. And then he has a shorter imprisonment the third time. The king decides to re-imprison him, and he stays there until his death.
So Raleigh died in prison?
Well, he died. He was executed. And not actually inside the prison. They took him out for a public execution. And that's, to me, one of the most exciting parts of the story is just how he deals with his impending death. It was a very famed episode that had, great legacy in England, because when he is executed, there's widespread feeling of sympathy for Raleigh that he, had never committed treason to begin with, and that, King James just didn't like him and so on. So there was a feeling that Raleigh was wronged. And there were people who watched his execution who later play a role in the execution of King Charles, King James's son. They become anti-monarchical and become leaders in the English Civil War, a decade later. And for them, watching Raleigh so unfairly be executed convinced them, or gave them their first convincing of how evil monarchy could be. And of course, they're going to do away with the monarchy 10 years later, essentially. So even his death had, great impact in society, and his writings, a lot of which he wrote from prison, including his History of the World, but he wrote many political tracts. They have a great shelf life. He's even, in some ways, in the beginning, much better read than Shakespeare is because of all these pamphlets and because of his books. And many people will publish works under his name after he's dead to give their writings gravitas. If they're writing about politics and strategy, even John Milton signed a very lengthy piece, Walter Ralegh, to try and get people to support these political opinions because they'll think they were Raleigh's rather than his own.
You just mentioned that there was a question about Raleigh's treason, whether he committed treason or he didn't. So could you tell us about Raleigh's act of treason and why he was executed?
Well, the treason itself, there were a couple plots after James was made king where there were other candidates that people wanted. And without going into those plots, some of Raleigh's enemies accused Raleigh of being in on the big plot, although there were no witnesses. or I should say there was one alleged witness, a friend of his. And in fact, it said that after this trial, you had to have two witnesses for treason, not one. And the witness himself actually took back everything he said. And he said he knew of Raleigh committing no treason. But Raleigh was dangerous. He was a free thinker. He was unorthodox. He had a lot of people who saw him as the last of Elizabeth's heroes. So many of those heroes had died, many of them dying in battle or, dying on ship. And Raleigh was, the last of the great knights, essentially. And his reputation had become bigger than the king's. So it's sort of like the king couldn't trust having Raleigh out because the king is Scottish. And there was a lot of dis-ease about having a Scottish king for England. And so when he met Raleigh, he didn't like Raleigh to begin with. He didn't like his religious philosophy, whereas Raleigh was very open to a lot of things spiritually and philosophically. The king had put 300 plus people to death in Scotland as witches, who he said were trying to kill him. And he wrote a book about demonology. He was worried about demons. And Raleigh wrote, demons basically don't exist. So philosophically and temperamentally, they were two very different people. And when Raleigh met the king, he thought the king was going to pick up Elizabeth's mantle and challenging Spain. And that was the last thing the king wanted to hear. He wanted to make peace with Spain. So Raleigh was in the way, and he was, in a sense, a convenient scapegoat to end the Elizabethan era. By throwing him in prison, it was like saying, I'm the king, not Elizabeth. I'm who everybody needs to look to. And he wasn't willing to execute him because in a related plot, one of the individuals who was of nobility was executed. And when it was shouted, long live the king, nobody joined in. And James was taken aback by that. And he realized, I have to walk more carefully here. I'm not going to execute Raleigh. He's too popular. I'll just put him in prison. And so he kept him there for years. And what's fascinating is that his wife adored Raleigh, and she brought her son, the prince, to Raleigh to meet him. And he wrote several tracts while he's in prison for the prince, basically on how to be a king, on statecraft. So the wife's support helped keep him alive, and then the prince. And I write about in the book this dramatic episode of how the prince finally convinces the king to let Raleigh out of prison and to restore him his estates. It's just a great story. And then the prince, who's only a young man, he's like 16 years old at the time, he dies. And when that happens, the king's like, nah, never mind. And Raleigh's left to rot in prison until he finally convinces the king that he should let him out because he knows where El Dorado is, the lost city of gold, and says, I can make you the richest man in Christendom. And by then, the king, he's really in debt. And he thinks, what do I have to lose now? It's years since Raleigh was in prison. That he's been there. It's like 13 years now. He doesn't seem to be the danger that he was. And so he lets him out. But when Raleigh fails, that's when he puts him back and he decides he needs to have his head taken for a variety of reasons.
Now, throughout our conversation, we've talked a lot about Raleigh's many pursuits in life. How he was an alchemist, a soldier, the architect of England's colonization schemes. And I wonder, as you look at the entirety of Sir Walter Raleigh's life, Alan, how do you think we can use his story to better understand early North American history and perhaps even the wider project of European colonization?
I think, there's a few things. One is to see what Raleigh opposed. And Raleigh recognized and opposed this idea that within a society, everybody has to be the same culturally. And that had long been felt, and of course, America's a melting pot, but there's still this idea that we all have to have the same culture. And Raleigh opposed those ideas and said, that's not, how to achieve success. So I think that's fascinating in and of itself, is his tolerance of culture, and that, we can have a successful society even if people maintain their culture. We don't have to all melt together. I think that's important, right off the start. And it's his openness. It's his openness to learning. And really, many of his fellows, men and women, are like this. They are open to trying to understand the universe and to connect their physical and spiritual lives together. And they are cynical people about what humans do, but at the same time, they retain their idealism that the world can be improved. It's a time of melancholy in England and in Europe, deep melancholy. You see it in their music, you see it in their writing. But despite that melancholy, they do break out of it. I think, to me, when Shakespeare says to be or not to be, you get generations of Europeans who say, yes, to be, yes, we can stand up, we can do. And on other times they go, oh boy, what have we got ourselves into? And, they lose their confidence. But they tend to retain their idealism. And I think that's something we can learn from Raleigh in this time period, that even when things are really bad, when your countries, could be conquered, when you do have doubts about yourself and what you're doing, that you retain those utopian ideals, that we can move forward. And the way to do so is by remaining open to ideas. And Raleigh writes about this in his last book. It's 1,500 pages, A History of the World. And a lot of it is about this balance between cynicism, keeping your eyes open because of human nature, and on the other hand, about the wonders of the world, of the universe, that we can improve the universe. And a lot of this is about learning from other peoples, that we learn from each other. So to me, that's what I would carry away.
We should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Now, in your opinion, Alan, what might have happened if Walter Raleigh had not married Elizabeth Bess Throckmorton? If Raleigh had not married one of Queen Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting and thereby not greatly upset Elizabeth I, how might things have turned out differently for Walter Raleigh?
Well, for one thing, he wouldn't have gone off to South America to look for El Dorado. Once he's exiled, he feels helpless. And he's still doing work for the crown, but he can't come see the Queen. He can't come to court. He's invited back. But he looked to do something spectacular. And so he went to try to make Queen Elizabeth the richest woman in Christendom. And he went off to El Dorado. That wouldn't have happened. He would have instead, at least according to other historians, he probably would have become her first minister. Her two main ministers were both elderly, and he was so talented and trusted by the Queen, he probably would have actually, remained in London near the Queen, becoming one of her, if not the first ministers. And he wouldn't have become the hero of the Battle of Cadiz, naval battle. He wouldn't have gone off on these journeys anymore because she would have needed him to run the government right there. So I think he would have had a different life in that way. He still would have, I think, because of his interest, worked in the laboratory, write books, write poems, and so on. But he wouldn't have been the adventurer that we now know.
So, Alan, now that you finally had time to research Walter Raleigh's life, what aspect of history are you working on now?
After doing all these books on the Atlantic world, I'm sort of switching over to the Pacific, and I'm looking at the First Nations people, what we call the Northwest Coast, from Southeast Alaska down to Washington State. These are the group of native peoples we associate with totem pole making. And my purpose is to look at how they contended with colonialism from the time that Captain Cook showed up in the 1770s, really all the way into the 1950s, how they used their art and their stories as a way to maintain their cultures, their societies, and negotiate colonialism in the early modern and modern world. So that's what I'm doing. I'm looking a lot at art and how art was used by the peoples who created it.
And say we have more questions about Walter Raleigh and early English ideas about colonization. How can we get in contact with you?
You can find more information out about me on the Texas Christian University Department of History website and my name. And there's a bit more about me. And you can contact me. My email is there too, agallay@tcu.edu. And you can contact me that way as well.
Alan Gallay, thank you for introducing us to Sir Walter Ralegh and early English ideas about colonization.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to sit and talk with you about my book.
Sir Walter Ralegh seems to have lived a very full life. He was an alchemist, a soldier, a courtier par excellence, an explorer, a pirate, a prisoner, and the architect of England's plans to colonize the Americas. Raleigh was also a man of the Renaissance. Like many in this period, he believed that God created everything, and that the best thing humans could do was to study the material world around them, so that they could discover God's purpose in all things. This belief is why Walter Raleigh, alchemist, was also Walter Raleigh, colonizer. Raleigh believed that America offered new opportunities to access a material world unknown to Europe. And with this access, Raleigh and his fellow alchemists believed that they could find more information about God's purpose. Now, like many scientists of his age, Raleigh needed a patron to back his work. And due to his familial connections, bravery on the battlefield, good looks, natural charm, and keen intellect, his patron turned out to be Queen Elizabeth I. And with Elizabeth's backing, Raleigh held a monopoly right to colonize North America for England. Now, it took Raleigh many years of planning and a few voyages to North America to develop a plan for colonization that he thought would be successful. In the end, his plan included tolerance, respect, and cooperation with Native American peoples, and establishing a colony north of Roanoke in the Chesapeake Bay. Plus, we can also see from Raleigh's work in Ireland that once established, he would have developed solid plans to bring Jamestown into the world of Atlantic commerce. Because for Raleigh and for England, English colonies had to earn an income that, along with farming, would make them self-sustaining and hopefully profitable. Of course, by the time the English established Jamestown, Raleigh had been imprisoned in the Tower of London and was no longer in charge of England's plans for colonization. Now, as Alan related, it might have been an interesting turn in history if Raleigh had been in charge of Jamestown. As we've discussed in other episodes, Jamestown was not a settlement that accepted or implemented Raleigh's views of cultural and religious toleration, or his ideas that Native American peoples might have something to teach the English. So the English colony of Jamestown and all the other English colonies that came after it often had rocky and antagonistic relationships with their Native American hosts and their Native American neighbors. You'll find more information about Alan, his book, Walter Raleigh, plus notes for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/274. Don't forget to join the Omohundro Institute for a conversation on equality. This live event will take place on Wednesday, June 10 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. It's a free event. All you need to do is register at benfranklinsworld.com/register. That's benfranklinsworld.com/register. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed today's episode, would you please tell your friends and family about it? Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Kayla Pittman, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what did you find most fascinating about Sir Walter's life and his plans for colonization? I know, there's a lot to choose from here, and I'm really excited to read your answers. So please send your thoughts to liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and production for this episode was made possible by a grant from the Roller-Bottimore Foundation of Richmond, Virginia.